So today I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker, Theresa Robinson. She's one of our colleagues here at JNCC, and she will be sharing insights from her PhD research in a talk titled Past, Present and Future Fodies. So Fodies are small endangered birds from the Western Indian Ocean, and Theresa's research looks at how conservation efforts like supplemental feeding are influencing them. She'll explore how monitoring data can help us understand the impact of these strategies and why the outcomes aren't always as straightforward as we might hope. So without further delay, I'll hand over to today's speaker. Theresa, over to you.
Hi there. Hopefully everyone can see my title screen now. So yes, I'm Theresa or Tree Robinson. I joined JNCC at the start of January. I'm in the NCPA team. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of my PhD research and also a little bit about the ongoing research that I'm doing on Mauritius Fodies, which are these dudes. This is a male in his breeding plumage, and he's very gorgeous. I titled this talk Past, Present and Future Fodies. This slightly drier title on this slide is actually the sort of main title of my thesis. And the sort of motivation for this work was that we really wanted to dive into the huge amount of data that I was provided with and see if we could unpack the impacts of supplemental food on this population. But also a key part of this was to use that data to try and forecast what future conservation management scenarios might look like and how they might influence this species. So a little bit of conservation context for you. You'll all know this. We're currently going through the 6th global extinction event, but this is the first one which is largely, if not entirely, driven by anthropomorphic causes, such as habitat loss, and climate change is effectively a type of habitat loss in this context. Also invasive species, overexploitation of habitats and species, and also the cascading effects of all of these, which can influence entire ecosystems. And I've put tortoises in brackets there because I'm going to come back and talk to you a little bit later about the effects of tortoises and how they can be used in terms of habitat restoration. So again, most of you will know all of this. Conservation science is looking to protect endangered species. This is a juvenile Fodie who's just had his rings put on. You can see the coloured bands here and the ID band. And these coloured bands are really important. They allow the birds to be identified visually without needing to recapture them. And that's a really big part of the data that I was provided with. So management of endangered species like this is often ad hoc, and this is because it's difficult to experiment on critically endangered species. We don't have time. It can be ethically difficult, and when you've got a very low number of species, it can be practically difficult to implement as well. So retrospective analyses like that, which formed my PhD, can feed into species monitoring, but that requires data, and it requires a lot of data in order to come to sort of rigorous conclusions about what's happening. And as you will also all know, ecological data is incredibly messy. So a big part of my sort of PhD journey, as it were, is learning how to manage ecological data sets, learning how to clean them, and learning how to sort of make inference from the data that they contain. So I'm going to yap at you a little bit about the history of Mauritius right now, and then I'll come back shortly onto some of the sort of conclusions from my specific research. So Mauritius was discovered by humans in about 975, and there's been permanent human habitation of the island since 1598. The dodo, you'll all know about the dodo, was extinct less than 60 years after that human habitation arrived in 1598, largely because of the introduction of pigs, but also a certain amount of human hunting and overexploitation. This picture here is a life-size bronze dodo, which is installed on Îles Egret, where my research was based. And it's really quite disconcerting if you don't know it's there. If you're walking quietly along a trail, come around a corner, and suddenly there's a dodo. But it's very cool to see. Since 1598, Mauritius has also lost 10 other endemic bird species and hundreds of other species. And this is because, this is a terrifying statistic, but in that 500 years, Mauritius has lost 98% of its natural habitat. There is some habitat remaining, but it's highly degraded. There are invasive species almost across the entire island. And so, yeah, the space remaining for the endemic and endangered species is very minimal. But there's been a huge amount of conservation work and conservation effort happening over the last 40 or 50 years in Mauritius. And as a result of that, it's one of the few places in the world where biodiversity metrics are increasing alongside New Zealand and Hawaii. So we've got a lot of experience of island conservation. Some of that's come out of Mauritius. Some of you may know of Carl Jones. Some of you may even have worked with Carl Jones, but he is one of the sort of spearheading of island conservation, particularly in Mauritius, since the 70s. He works with Durrell Wildlife Foundation. He worked with Gerald Durrell, and he's also, I think, chief scientist at the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation. He's been, I can't state how influential he's been in Mauritius conservation in the last 40 years or so. He is credited with saving more species from extinction than any other human being, which is quite a remarkable statistic. The Mauritius kestrel was supposed to be declared functionally extinct in the 1970s, and literally with his own two hands, he saved the species from extinction. This is a baby Mauritius kestrel sitting in Carl's lap in the picture. He sort of he force bred the I think there was one female left. He force bred the female, and she kept on laying eggs, and he kept on hand rearing them. And there are now getting on for 800 or 900 Mauritius kestrels living in the wild, and they are example species for an awful lot of genetic conservation work, but also they're living wild and free in Mauritius. But they were down to 4 individuals in the 1970s, which is quite remarkable. He's also done similar work on the echo parakeet and the Mauritius pink pigeon. All of these species were down to fewer than 20 individuals, and have recovered to significantly more than those numbers as a result of Carl and the work that he's done with the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation. More recently, the focus for the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation has been on the Mauritius olive white-eye. I haven't got any pictures of those, but that's not my focus. My focus is the Mauritius Fodie, lots of other species, including several reptiles. And I had to include this picture. This is a juvenile Mauritius kestrel, which I helped with ringing. And I joked to Carl at the time that this is like his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild, because this bird would not exist if it wasn't for the work that Carl has done to save these species from extinction. So my research was just based on Île aux Aigrettes, and I'm going to show you a picture of that in just a minute. It's a tiny island off the coast of Mauritius, and it's been rented and under intensive restoration by the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation since the 1980s. A majority of invasive species have been removed, but there are some that remain. I think they still have shrews there, and there are new invasive species which are causing a concern, such as crows, which have been on Mauritius for a long time but have recently sort of tried to invade Île aux Aigrettes, and those can be a huge concern for the conservation of small birds. However, it is still used as a safe haven for lots of the endangered Mauritius species. This is a pink pigeon on this slide, and there is a huge amount of data and field work collected on Île aux Aigrettes. So there's a field team living on the island permanently. They go out and collect data on all of the species that are being protected there on a daily basis. And again, I'll come back later on to the data that I use for my thesis, but my endless gratitude to them for all the hard work that they put in, and the level of detail that they're able to put into the data that they collect from the island. So I'm just going to show you some maps quickly. I'm sure you all know where Mauritius is, but this is a demonstration of scale as apart from anything else. So obviously this is the east coast of Africa and Madagascar, and then the white box is Mauritius and Réunion, and then we'll zoom into that. Mauritius is 70 miles north to south and about 40 miles east to west, so it's pretty small on a sort of geographical scale. And Île aux Aigrettes, where all of my Fodies live and all of these other species live, is in this next box, which is here. This tiny green circle is Île aux Aigrettes. It's about 400 meters across. I can never remember what that means in hectares because my brain doesn't compute hectares, but it's pretty small. And so all of my Fodies, all of the Mauritius olive white-eyes, the pink pigeons, and lots of other species live on that tiny green speck inside the reef just off the coast of Mauritius. So I spoke about the intensive conservation work that's happened on Île aux Aigrettes. There was a real issue when Mauritian Wildlife Foundation started working there about trying to get some of the endemic tree seeds to germinate, and this is really difficult to happen. This is an example of ecological breakdown that can happen when an ecosystem is subjected to all of the threats that I talked about before. And some research was done which showed that a lot of these endemic tree species, the seeds germinate best after they've passed through the gut of a giant tortoise. But Mauritius used to have 2 of its own endemic species of giant tortoise, but they were all unfortunately eaten by the early explorers because they found out that you can keep a giant tortoise on a ship for a very long time and it won't die. So even though tortoise meat apparently is horrible, you do get fresh meat for months and months at a time because they take a really long time to starve to death. So, which is an unpleasant story. So a slightly pleasanter story for you. when Darwin was on his way home on his second voyage on the Beagle, he passed through the Indian Ocean. And I don't think he ever went to Mauritius, but when he got home, another conservationist wrote to him and explained to him the issue of all of the Indian Ocean giant tortoises, which were then being lost. And as a result of that, Darwin wrote to the governments of Aldabra and the Seychelles and Mauritius, and I think some of the other Indian Ocean countries, and said, you need to move some of your tortoises from Aldabra, because that was the only country that had any tortoises left, need to move some to other places in the Indian Ocean as a safeguard. So that happened as a direct result of pressure from Charles Darwin. And I think several hundred tortoises were moved from Aldabra to Mauritius. And then probably 15, 20 years ago, as a result of the work that Carl Jones and everyone else has been doing on germination of tree seeds, some of those tortoises were moved from the mainland of Mauritius to Îles when they trundle around and they eat the tree seeds and they help with tree seed germination, and they're really helping with the sort of regeneration of the habitat. And the really cool thing about this is that some of the tortoises, and I'm going to show you a video in a second, some of these tortoises are old enough to be the original individuals moved from Aldabra to Mauritius at the behest of Charles Darwin himself, which I think is just an amazingly cool stat. And I put poop on this slide just because that's their function. They spend a lot of time eating tree seeds and leaves. They do a lot of pooing, and that is what helps the habitat regenerate, excuse me, for the benefit of all of the bird species that live on Îles. So hopefully my video is going to work. This is a giant tortoise. I absolutely love these. I adore Fodies. I think they're amazing, but I'm very familiar with a small bird. I'm completely unfamiliar with anything like this. So wandering around Îles and seeing these guys wandering around trying to bite you, it's just amazing. I absolutely loved it. Plus they're absolutely hilarious. So this is an Aldabra giant tortoise. Okay, so a little bit more about Fodies in particular. This is a female Fodie on this slide. In around about the 1990s, there were no more than about 200 pairs remaining, at which point they were critically endangered. That decline from the previous high numbers was due primarily to habitat loss and introduced predators, because they're very susceptible to rats and monkeys, which are now spread across the whole of mainland Mauritius. So the conservation effort primarily involved a translocation of mainland individuals onto Îles. They moved about 90 birds, and since they were released there, all of these birds have had access to supplemental food every day. The island is very small, so the birds pretty much all access that supplementary food on a daily basis. And so part of the main interest I had in terms of my thesis was I really wanted to unpack the impacts of accessing that supplemental food on individual fitness. And again, a reminder that all of these conclusions rely on the quality of data. And so actually for a tropical species, this is a really unusual opportunity to explore these kind of impacts because of the amount of data that I was given. So we split the components of fitness. So overall fitness you might count as fledglings per season. We split this into its components, which is the nests per season and the fledglings per nest. And those two components sort of combine together to give you an overall measure of fitness. I should probably mention actually that Fodies nest multiple times within a breeding season. So obviously nests per season is almost always more than one. So yes, those two components combine to give you the overall total seasonal fitness. Another interesting thing about this particular population of Fodies is that they have an extremely wide variety of mating systems observed on the island. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that now, but I'm going to come back to it later in the talk. So just quickly, I am going to talk you through the data that I had available and what I did with it. And this is all, as I said, collected by the daily fieldwork effort on Îles. So there's a stud book which records every bird pretty much that's been born into the population since the releases first happened, which comes to something like 650 birds, and that includes a lot of demographic information about each individual bird. So when they were born, when they died, who their parents were, who their offspring were, all that kind of thing. Then also we have a huge data set of nesting attempts. This actually runs to over 2,000 nesting attempts, but because we know from previous research, Fodies use nest building as a social and a pair bond activity. And so for these purposes, we only considered nests with eggs laid in them, and these therefore sort of represent a serious breeding effort as opposed to a social pair bonding activity. And then we have a huge resightings list. So all the field workers on the island monitor the feeding station every day, twice a day, and every resighting of every bird is recorded. This came to more than 17,000 records of a bird within a particular month. And I used this to do some survival analysis, which we used for some of the work later on. Please don't ask me about the survival analysis. It almost killed me. It was an absolute nightmare, but we got usable estimates of survival in the end. And then territory mapping, which I'm going to demonstrate for you in a second. Within each breeding season, each male's territory was recorded on a map, and that was absolutely key to the work that I wanted to do, unpacking access to supplemental food, because we could use the distance of a territory to the feeding station as a sort of metric of access and what that might look like. So I had to do an awful lot of data cleaning. A lot of these records were made by hand. A lot of them were made a fair number of years ago now. So there were an awful lot of detective work involved to try and make sure that the data was clean, and a certain amount of data had to be excluded just because it wasn't reliable enough or of the quality necessary to be included. So, for example, in the nesting attempts, if a male bird nested with one female 11 times and then apparently a different bird on the 12th time, but the 12th bird was apparently a male that had died, but his identification code was one letter different to the female, or for example it was an 8 instead of a 3, that kind of thing. In that kind of circumstance you can sometimes be fairly certain it's actually a mistake, but you can't always do that. So I did have to exclude a certain number of records just to make sure that I was only analysing reliable records. And I also did a fair amount of data manipulation. So I took the nesting record data and the stud book record data, and from those created what I called bird seasons. So each line in the data set represented a breeding season for a bird, and that summarized things like how many nesting attempts they made, how many fledglings they had, how many eggs, how many chicks they had, and lots of other sort of derived data. And that's what a huge amount of my analyses were based on. So the territory metric that we used, this slightly confusing looking map, is actually the outline of Île aux Aigrettes. So the squares that you can see, the grid references in the background, that's the outline of Île aux Aigrettes. The black lines or black circles are territory mapping, and this is done by the field workers on Île aux Aigrettes. So they go out and they look for conflict points, they look for where birds are hanging out, and from that, for each breeding season, they generated a territory map. So I had one of these for each of the breeding seasons included in my data. The square in the middle, which you can't really see because it's covered with arrows, is where a feeding station is. And then the green, amber and red arrows indicate a very high quality territory, a medium territory, and then a red territory, which is much further away from the feeding station. And so what I wanted to get at and we'll try and unpack is whether the access to food as mediated by this territory distance from a feeding station has any impact on individual productivity. In terms of the structure of the analyses, we divided it in half more or less, and we analysed these two separately. So the first one was individual metrics, which are things that are specific to a bird. So these are things like age, this territory distance, the mating systems that this bird uses, breeding phenology, and that kind of thing. So those are all things that vary in between birds. But we also had a lot of access to climate data and various other things. And this is data which influence everybody in the population equally. So we split the analyses in half, and we analysed the individual predictors separately from these population level metrics. And I'm just going to quickly give you a sort of whistle-stop tour through some of the things that we found were significantly positive or significantly negative for this population. The main thing which came through very clearly in all of the analyses was that breeding phenology, as in the relative start of breeding within a breeding season, is incredibly important for these birds. Birds that start breeding earlier do better than birds that start breeding later. Also pair familiarity, so these birds breed with the same partner multiple times, and the more times a pair is bred together, the more successful they will be. Also, we had a couple of, I think, very interesting climate impacts. So the storm days over a season, so a storm day is a particularly extreme rainfall event. Storm days are positive. They have a positive impact on fitness for these birds, and likewise increasing average temperature has a positive impact on these birds. And we don't know exactly why this is, but my sort of hypothesis is that because they nest with dry leaves and dry plant material, the storm days allow the plants to grow because it's wet, but then increasing temperature allows the leaves to dry, and it's the dry leaves and dry plant material that the Fodies use to nest. So that's my sort of working hypothesis for those. And territory has a positive influence, but only on the number of nests per season. And I'm going to, again, come back to this later on. In terms of negative effects, unpaired birds is bad for both sexes, and this is primarily due to competition. So if a male doesn't have a territory, he's going to be flying around starting conflict with other males trying to take their territories away. Increasing age past a threshold has a negative impact on breeding output. There's an interesting impact of pre-seasonal rain days. So this is rain in the few months before the breeding season starts has a negative effect on female birds. And this is actually seen in some other passerine species, because that's the time of year when the female is really trying to pack on body condition for, especially in this species, for repeated breeding attempts. And there are thoughts in other passerine species that if the female can't do that, if she can't pack on body condition, then she's not going to be able to breed as sort of intensively in the following breeding season. And also we saw a clear sign of density dependence in as much as the population increases in size, breeding metrics and fitness metrics decreased, which, as I said, is pretty much what you would expect. So to note here, there's no impact of mating systems on any of these metrics, and I'm going to come back to that again later. And also territory, we were surprised, actually only has an impact on nests per season. It doesn't have any impact on overall productivity. So we wanted to do some more digging and find out sort of what was going on in this, especially because the impact of relative start was so strong. Wanted to unpack that a little bit more and try and sort of find out what was going on. And so what we found was that there is no direct impact of access to food on breeding success. However, access to supplemental food, as in the territory distance to a feeding station, massively increases the relative start of the breeding attempt for each individual bird. So the nearer they are to the feeding station, the earlier they can start breeding. And this is really important because birds that nest early do better, and nests which are initiated early in the season also do better than nests that are initiated later. So we did find a very strong impact of supplemental food, but it is mediated by this aspect of relative start. And as I said on the previous slide, territory proximity does also increase the number of nests per season. And that was really key for the population viability analyses, which I'm going to come on to in a minute. So this figure is slightly terrifying, but I have a very visual brain, and I wanted to generate this plot because for me, it really demonstrates exactly what's happening within this population. So I'm going to try and explain it to you. And hopefully it will make sense by the time I've finished explaining it. So each vertical bar indicates a breeding season for a bird. So these are the nesting attempts of one individual bird linked by a line. The colour of the line indicates the total number of fledglings that bird had during that breeding season. So red is bad, fading to green, which is much better. And there's a couple of dark green lines, which I think are 6+ fledglings per season. The icons are a nesting attempt. And specifically the date of initiation of a nesting attempt. And the shape of the icon tells you what happened to each nesting attempt. So if you look at the bird in the lower panel towards the right-hand end, there's two triangles linked with a red line. This bird had 2 nesting attempts. They both failed during incubation. He had no fledglings in that breeding season. And you can see, obviously, there's a very long line in the top panel, which is a bird who had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 nesting attempts. He also didn't fledge any birds that season. The panels are then indicating the growing phase of the population, which is the first 4 years of my data, and then the stable phase when the population had reached carrying capacity, which is the following, I think, 8 years of my data. So breeding seasons for each bird indicating the nests, and then the population split by the growing phase and the stable phase of the population. And the take-home message from this is, oh, and sorry, I should explain the axes. The x-axis along the bottom is territory distance from a feeding station. So 0 is really good. These are birds that are really close to the feeding station, and 12 is obviously the most distant birds. And then the y-axis across each panel is the relative start of the breeding attempt. And this is, if you're interested, in days from the 1st of April, because that's when the breeding season starts. So hopefully you can see what I can see in this graph, and I have stats to show that the relative start of breeding is much earlier when you're near to a feeding station in the stable phase of the population. So for the bottom panel, there's a diagonal line starting lower down on the left-hand side and going up as the birds start later as they get further away from the feeding station. And there's a similar an opposite line at the top. So birds nearer the feeding station carry on breeding later than birds that are further away. So effectively, there's a sort of funnel in the bottom part of this graph only. So the breeding seasons are much longer. They start earlier and they run later for territories that are near the feeding station than they do for the territories which are much further away. So this for me is a sort of very visual way of understanding the impact that supplemental feeding has on this population. Hopefully that was clear. Feel free to ask me any questions if it's not. What we wanted to do after having unpacked those individual and population level effects was to do some population viability analysis, because this enables you to forecast into the future what a management impact might have. And this is really important because this population of Fodies has a sort of has a competing dual role as a refuge and a source, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But as I said earlier, you can't always experiment on endangered species. It's not ethical. You might not have the time. You might not have the individuals available to actually do that experimentation. But population viability analyses in programs like Vortex enables you to try and explore the impact of varying management scenarios, in this case, using demographic rates which you've extracted from the data that you have. Again, reliable data is essential in this, and this is why I'm so grateful to the Marine and Wildlife Foundation, because they provided me with the data for doing all of this. So the management scenarios that we wanted to investigate in order to determine whether this population can actually fulfill its dual role as a refuge and a source for further future translocations, we wanted to model 3 scenarios. First of all, a stable population. This is the Elizabeth population as it is now, as if nothing was to change going into the future. The second was starting out with the current population, but then harvesting it. And the harvest that we modelled was 15 individuals of each sex for 3 years, and that comes to a total of 90 individuals. And we chose that number because that very closely mirrors the actual reintroduction of the Elizabeth population itself. And we modelled these populations based on known demographic rates. So I'm going to come back to the territory mapping again of Elizabeth. And what we did was divide the population up into 6 distance bins away from the feeding station, which are represented by these coloured areas. So we modelled 6 population scenarios which represent 6 potential levels of management intensity or effort to determine the impact of these on a population level response. So we took the demographic rates, specifically breeding rates, from the birds that we know of in each of these 6 distance bins, and we use those to represent 6 different population scenarios. So the birds in the green circle right in the middle, this would represent very intense management where you input enough feeding stations that everybody in your population has easy access to a feeder. And then all the way out to the grey ring at the outside, and you can simulate a population based on these birds with the demographic rates where nobody has easy access to a feeder and everybody has to travel a really long way. So we based these scenarios on the demographic rates we observed in these 6 distance bins. And we actually took the average rate of all observed birds within each of these distance bins to simulate these management scenarios. And what Vortex does, you plug in the demographic variables that you want to use, and then it will run 1,000 iterations for you over 25 years of a future population. And then it will give you you can extract each of the 1,000, but it will also give you an average rate for each specific scenario from those 1,000. So in terms of population growth rates, this is at the top, we've got the stable population scenario. In the middle, we've got the harvested population scenario. And at the bottom, we've got the new population scenario. The red dotted lines are a population growth rate of 1, which is what you need in order to maintain your current population size. And the key thing to note on this graph and the next one is that bin number 6, so those birds in the grey area, which are furthest away from the feeding station, have significantly different demographic rates and therefore population growth rates than the birds in the other 5 bins. Bins 1 to 5 are effectively very similar to each other. Bin 6 was different in each of these scenarios. So the population growth rate, obviously our standard errors are much wider, but in general, the population growth rates were significantly lower for bin 6 than they were for bins 1 to 5. And what that actually looks like in terms of the population growth rates, so these are population trajectories for 25 years for each of the same 3 scenarios. So we've got stable, harvest and new. And these plots all actually have the 6 bin lines on them, but they're overwritten in several cases, especially in the stable population at the top. The pink line is bin number 6, so these birds with the reduced demographic rates. And what you can see is for the stable population, if they were to be managed at the intensity of bin 6, the population would not be maintained at its current numbers. Likewise, for the harvested population, the population does increase, but it doesn't reach any kind of carrying capacity within the 25-year scenario. And the new population, again, does not reach carrying capacity over those 25 years. So some of the conclusions for my PhD were primarily that supplemental food is actually supporting high numbers for this population and has increased its recovery from being critically endangered. The Fodies now been downlisted to just endangered, which is great. And a large part of that will be because of the supplemental food, which is available to all of these birds. I actually had a really interesting conversation with somebody from the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation about these birds, because I had a sort of a concern, I guess, that this population of Fodies is almost semi-artificial because they are living together so intensively and they're managed. And he actually said he saw it as the opposite way around. The mainland population, the remnant population on mainland Mauritius, are living very dispersed from each other. The reproductive rates are obviously much lower, but he sees that as a more artificial situation for the Fodies. Fodies historically would have lived in very high densities around seabird colonies, and that means that they would have lived very high density. They would have probably exhibited behaviours much more like the Ilizagret population than what's left on the mainland. So that was actually reassuring for me, because he thinks, as I said, that the Ilizagret population is actually much more representative of this species historically than a very highly dispersed mainland population is. And so also we concluded that the Fodie management can actually maintain this dual role of the Fodie population in as much as it will maintain the current high numbers, but it will also firstly enable the population to recover after a harvest, and management of this type and at this similar level of intensity will also enable new populations translocated elsewhere, all other things being equal, will allow them to establish quickly and hopefully increase the population of the species even further. So that's sort of whistle-stop tour of 8 years of my PhD. But you might notice that earlier on I mentioned to you about the mating systems, and we were fully expecting the mating systems to pop up and be important in some way in terms of the demographic rates of this species, but they didn't. And we sort of ran out of time to come back to this within my thesis, but I'm doing some work now to try and unpack actually what's going on in terms of the mating systems. So there's a weird and wonderful array of mating systems happening. We have monogamy, which I'm sure you know is one male bird, one female bird, no overlapping nests. We have polygyny, which is a male bird having overlapping nests with more than one different female. And I think we've got one male who had 3 nests on the go with 3 different females at the same time, so he was quite busy. We have a small amount of polyandry, which is a female bird with multiple nesting attempts with 2 different males, which is quite unusual for a bird of this type. Not very much of that, but it is observed in this population. And also a mating system that possibly doesn't even have a name, which is where the same pair of birds have multiple overlapping nesting attempts. And what's likely happening there is that the male parent will be feeding dependent chicks or young fledglings from the first nest, while the female has already started laying and brooding eggs for the next nesting attempt. And we sort of felt sure that some of this behaviour was going to be enabled by access to supplemental food, because it's not observed in the mainland population at all. But as I said, it didn't come out in my thesis, but we're just doing some work now which might be sort of revealing some of what's happening here. And this is, we came up with a new measure, which is not the distance from the feeding station, but it's how many territories a male crosses on his way to the feeding station. This is a sort of example. We're actually calling it competition because initially we thought that that might be a negative thing. If he's crossing other territories, he's passing male birds, he might be involved in more conflict. But actually, it turns out it's a positive thing. So males who travel across multiple other territories on their way to the feeding station are also exposed to more female birds. And I'm just doing some work right now in the last couple of weeks, which seems to show that these males who cross multiple territories are exposed to more female birds. They have more different female partners, and they nest more, and they're more successful than birds who don't pass so many other territories on the way to the feeder. This isn't polygyny of the classic kinds. These aren't multiple overlapping nests. This is serial non-overlapping nests with different female birds, which I think is incredibly interesting. And again, just going back to this graphic again, this is what this actually looks like. So all of the birds are named, by the way, which I love. I think it's hilarious. So this territory at the top here, this is heliotrope. He can get to the feeding station easily. He's got a very short territory distance, but he only passes 2 other female birds on his way. Whereas Jim down here, he's much further away, but he passes many, many, many more different female birds on his way to the feeding station. So what this might mean is that heliotrope up here has the benefit of being able to start nesting earlier because he has easy access to the feeding station. However, Jim down here, he doesn't start breeding any earlier necessarily, but he gets to do serial monogamy with lots of different females because he passes so many of them on his way to the feeding station. And I think this might be really interesting because there's not too many studies out there that actually show a sort of social impact of conservation management. So this might be an example of how conservation management is actually changing the behavior of the birds that it is impacting. And I think that's quite cool. And that's everything I have to talk to you about. I just say thank you to my supervisors, Ken Norris, Malk Nicol and Deepa. Also, thank you to Joe Taylor, by the way, who I work with now, who provided me with some of the climate data, and everyone at Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, especially Vikash and Carl, and also my perfect little male Fodie. Isn't he amazing? So that's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Tree. That was a brilliant talk. It was so fascinating. It makes me want to do a PhD on Fodies.
There's plenty of data out there.
Yes. We've got quite a few questions, which is great. So I'll start with the first one, which is, how did you do the survival analysis?
I could do an entire talk on that by myself. I don't know about really how much detail I can go into on this before. The survival analysis was complicated because we have ongoing observations. So a classic survival analysis is called capture, mark, recapture, and they assume, the statistical models assume that you're not going to be observing the birds in between your recapture scenarios. But in terms of daily field work, those statistical assumptions are possibly not valid. So I had to use a package in R called capture, mark, recapture, continuous time. And as I said, there's not enough hours in the day right now for me to talk to you about how CMRCT works or doesn't work. It was very complicated. It was very difficult. We were hoping to get much more out of the survival analysis than we actually did in the end. But we did actually in the end get workable sort of single point estimates for survival for adults and juveniles, which is all we needed for the vortex analysis.
Brilliant. Is there any likelihood of being able to reintroduce Fodies to mainland Mauritius, given the pressure from the rats and other things?
So 2 parts to this. Mainland Mauritius might be complicated. New Zealand has done quite a lot of work on what they call mainland islands, which can be fenced or fenced areas, or areas where, for example, you can do a lot of trapping of any invasive species. And New Zealand have had a lot of success with this kind of thing, but fenced mainland areas are astronomically expensive to implement and very difficult to maintain. So that may not be a viable option for Mauritius. Trapping might be. So if you have a network of rat traps, for example, in an area, then your breeding birds might be safer. But what the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation are going to be doing is reintroducing onto some of the other offshore islets of Mauritius. And there are lots of those which are similarly undergoing restoration. Some of you may have heard of Round Island. They would like eventually to put Fodies on Round Island and a few other of the offshore islets.
Thank you. And our next question is, how many feeding stations did you have and what use of breeding stations? So do birds use more than one or use others than the nearest? If there is competition for food?
Again, several parts to this answer. There are, for most of the time period of my data was only one feeding station. There were a few seasons with two. So for that case, in those cases, we calculated the territory distance just for the nearest feeding station. In terms of competition, when you're actually at the feeding stations and the birds are coming in and going out, Fodies are very loud and opinionated birds all the time, so they're constantly having little sort of scuffles and squeaking at each other and all the rest of it. I wouldn't say there is too much in the way of overt aggression. The birds possibly, I don't have data to back this up, but my impression is that birds sometimes access by family. So you might have a pair and their fledglings going into the feeding station for a few minutes, and then a few minutes later, the next male will come along and chase them out, and then his family will come in. But there's constant activity around the feeding stations all of the time. They're never quiet, which is actually great because that's where a lot of my data came from. And I can't remember what the other part of that question was. Remind me, Sophie.
So birds using more than one, or others than the nearest one in terms of competition?
I don't have data to answer that question. I get the impression probably they would just use the one that's easiest for them to access, but unfortunately the resighting data, one of the issues that we had with it is that they didn't record where the resighting happened, so I actually can't sort of back that up in any way, unfortunately.
Our next question is, if you had unlimited resources, what would be the next step in this research?
I think if I had unlimited resources, doing a fence mainland island in Mauritius would be amazing. There's an area called the Black River Gorges National Park where there are some native species which are doing quite well there. Fodies not so much, and the smaller birds not so much because of the introduced predators. So I think if you could fence off an area of Black River Gorges and make it safe for the Fodies and the olive white-eyes, that would be an amazing thing to do. And I think that they would love to implement that there. But I think the statistic was that it costs $1 million per mile per year of fencing in order to maintain it properly, to keep rats and other introduced predators out. And that is not available for Mauritius at the moment. But it would be an amazing thing to do.
How do you hope your research will inform or influence future conservation work?
One of the recommendations which we haven't quite formally made to the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation yet, but we will be, is that this evidence suggests that they only need to maintain one feeding station instead of two. So they are actually currently maintaining two. But if you remember that line, the plot I showed you with the coloured areas to represent the distance bins, only a very small amount of the island was not covered in bins 1 to 5 if they maintain the central feeding station. So they could actually, the data suggests they could actually just maintain that one and not feed at the other one, and it would probably barely have any difference at all to the current size of the population. So yeah, that's one thing for sure.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you know if your findings on supplemental food are similar to benefits of bird feeders in the UK or for other bird populations around the world?
I don't know about the UK actually. There's probably people here who know more about the impact of that in the UK than I do. In terms of other bird species around the world, another species that my PhD supervisor, Ken Norris, worked on is the Seychelles magpie robin, which was, I think, in the 80s for a while, the most endangered bird in the world. And they started supplemental feeding Seychelles magpie robins, and it went wrong. And actually, they found that when they implemented supplemental food for that population, breeding success metrics actually declined rather than going up. And the reason for that was that the birds are so territorial and so competitive that males who were on territories near to the feeders were spending all of their time in conflict over their territories and basically had none of their time left for anything else, including breeding. And so that's actually one of the reasons why we wanted to unpack these impacts for the Fodies, because they're also very territorial, but luckily didn't show that particular impact.
Thank you. I just Googled the magpie robin and they're very pretty.
They are very pretty. They are, yeah. So actually the outcome, sorry to interrupt again, the outcome in that case was not to supplemental feed them. The outcome was to make all of the habitat better quality, so that you didn't have such a gradient between good quality territories and bad quality territories. And so you had more males who were more happy to get on with breeding instead of fighting for their territories, which I think is actually really interesting in itself.
Were you able to measure cockoldry at all?
No, unfortunately don't have any genetic data for this species. It's one of my regrets. I can't really complain, but yes, I think it would be very interesting to find out if there's anything like that happening in the population. My instinct says that it probably is, but don't know.
What is the Fodie mating system on the mainland?
Nothing other than monogamy has been recorded or commented on. Nobody's ever really studied them in a huge amount of detail. There's like 2 papers published, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s. So nobody has done a huge amount of work on it. That population wasn't ringed, so even if they were doing something other than monogamy, it would have been hard to tell. But there was no suggestion of it, or no sort of consideration of it. So I think because they were living at fairly low density, it's unlikely they were doing anything other than monogamy.
And our final question is, thinking about other reintroductions on different islets, might you need more than one feeding station depending on the size of the islet?
Yes, absolutely, yes. The final chapter in my thesis actually sort of put a distance on that, if you see what I mean. So those 6 distance bins, we know exactly what the distance of those is. So yes, I mean, what I sort of envision is, if it's a bigger space, then you sort of have a grid potentially of feeding stations so that everybody has easy access. So yes.
Brilliant, thank you. That's all the questions we have. So I assume if anyone does have any more, they can send you an email or even
Absolutely.
a Teams message.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tree. That was a brilliant talk. I found it so interesting, and I'm sure everyone else did. And thank you everyone for coming to the talk today. I hope you have a lovely rest of the afternoon.
Thank you all.